Okay. So this is our fourth week of presenting photographers who were gracious enough to show us the work that's going on in Ukraine, show us their work and documenting this war between Russia and Ukraine, and with the thinking that a lot of this content will end up being used in one way or another for hopefully documenting, the war crimes that Putin has perpetrated on the Ukrainian public. So I want to thank a few of our sponsors, which is Epson, Photo Shelter, Archive Magazine, Pro Photo Daily, and American Photography. And this week we have a terrific lineup, and we're going to have Marcus Yam, Heidi Levine, Heathcliff O'Malley, Alex Laurie, and tonight we have Sasha Maslov, a Ukrainian-American photojournalist who was gracious enough to pull this together for us. So we really appreciate it. And Sasha, it's all yours.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, everybody who tuned in. I will show you some images from past few months covering the war and stories around the war. It's never been my passion to be a war photographer, and I don't still consider myself one. But of course, everything that's happening in my country, I felt and still feel that it's very important to tell stories from Ukraine and participate in that minimal capacity that I can to do anything I can with telling these stories. So I'll begin with showing a few images of stories I was working on before the war started. As you know, the world has been kind of tuned in the gathering of Russian army on Ukrainian border since end of November, beginning of December, and various governments, including American government, been ringing alarm bell. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, people maintained somewhat calm demeanor as for everything that's been going on. And one of the reasons for that is that the war has been ongoing since 2014. And Russia has been meddling in Ukraine for a very long time, and people there kind of got used to constant threat from Russia. So most people in the country were considering this as just a massive bullying and just another trick that Putin is playing on them. Not many people have believed on that the full-scale invasion would take place. They just couldn't imagine it, but unfortunately, as we all know, that didn't turn out to be true. So I'll start with some stories I was working on before the war started, and in January, I pitched a story for the Times, to the Times about how business is running in Ukraine in this atmosphere of constant threat of Russian invasion, and it was a story about various businesses and how they feel about this threat of war. And for the most people I talked with, everybody was very calm about it, and not many people again believed in the fact of a full-scale invasion, but of course just the general tension was there, and you can see it in some of these portraits. And these are some of the scenes of just peaceful, kind of normal life in Ukraine just a few weeks before the war started. These have been taken in January of this year, and
You have to share your screen, Sash.
Oh, I'm not sharing my screen?
No.
Sorry.
Okay.
Alrighty. What's that I doing? Do you guys see it now?
Yep, we got it.
Is it full screen?
You still have your deck on the left.
Okay. Sorry about
There you
that.
go. Perfect.
All right, so I'll start with the beginning. So these are just a couple of samples of stories I was working on before the war started, and the one I was talking about was about various businesses in Ukraine, and how they feel about threat of invasion. So as you see, it's kind of very peaceful, normal life in Kiev, and a lot of people are also unhappy with Zelensky because they felt that the threat is there, and he's not doing enough to prepare people, which rings truth. Zelensky ran a populist platform, and he was very shy of making unpopular decisions, and he did not want to create panic in Ukraine, and his cabinet was very kind of soft on preparing for the war.
How far? When are these photographs taken? Before the war. How much before?
This is January,
Okay.
so just a few weeks before the war. Yeah.
Okay.
Another story was on kind of other side of the spectrum. People started flocking into territorial defenses units. This territorial defense units are kind of civilian units preparing people to defend their hometowns for the most part. So these were taken also in Kiev. And this was during one of their trainings. And this is kind of like, this is a visual kind of the representation of one of these stories about just normal people starting to train and take arms in their hands. And this was, if I'm not mistaken, beginning of February already. At that time, I was traveling between New York and Kiev. And last time I was in Kiev was actually February 22nd, 2 days before the war started, on an ad job. And that will show you just how people were still running their lives without seeing this upcoming war. A few days later, I flew back. It was the beginning of March, and at that time already the war was raging. And I flew through Poland, and I got to Lviv, which was kind of established path for most journalists flying in to Ukraine and coming to Ukraine through the western border. And Lviv was just overflowing with people. A lot of people from the east, and Lviv became kind of a hub for people escaping war. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of coverage from that. My work mostly concentrates on portraits, and most of the stories I create are portrait based. So this one was a story about a theater that became a shelter for refugees or for temporary displaced people, and the woman on the right was one of the first people who was able to escape from Mariupol when they were able to open one of the corridors to let people out of that city. And she was one of the first people who came to Lviv and into this shelter. And you can, of course, see just the immense amount of suffering and worry and trauma on their expressions. Another story was on the work of Ukrainian railroads. This was shot for Fast Company. I wanted to show in this story the essential role that Ukrainian Railways has played in this war, with the air travel cut off for obvious reasons, and gas shortages. Railroad has become a very, very key link for people to escape from the war zones, which at that time were basically half of the country, and escape to the west. Ukrainian railroads kind of operated in this insane. I can't even say it's scheduled because there was no schedule. They started running these trains, evacuation trains, and everything was put together kind of on the fly. A lot of schedules been put together, like through WhatsApp chats and phone calls. Trains were running when they could run, trying to avoid areas where it's too dangerous. People were staying on the trains for months at a time, people who were working on the trains. For example, this woman is a train conductor, and she, at that time, though, when I photographed her, it was towards the end of the March. She was on a train nonstop for 1 month, basically taking showers at the stops where she could, but basically living in the same car for a month, helping people escape.
Yes, Sasha, quick question for you. The soldiers that we saw there and the people who are being trained to be soldiers, is there a lot of integration of that, or those people were just there to protect their own town?
The first images you saw from a territorial defense are civilians who had nothing to do with any sort of military operation, or had any military careers beforehand. They started training, and a lot of them were defending their cities, or fulfilling just duties, like delivering something or being on checkpoints. Just whatever needed to be done. But yes, they were mostly designated units to be in their cities, and that strategy proven to be very effective for Ukrainian government, because Russians who were coming in, they were unprepared for a massive resistance, first of all, and then second of all, they were not aware where they go, and they in the first days of war, everybody who was not moving west and remaining in their cities, towns, villages, what they were doing is they were painting over street signs, taking off road signs, doing everything to confuse Russians, because Russians were coming in such force. People were preparing basically for them to come in and to resist them in their villages, towns, cities. And territorial defense units are kind of like spearheaded all these operations. And of course, there's a regular army, which is quite sizable, but not compared to the Russian army. And it's the war's been going on for a long time, as I mentioned before. So there's at least a generation or two generations of people who already been in the service, and they've all been called back to the service. And besides that, there was a huge wave of volunteers, of people with military experience, starting from the Soviet war in Afghanistan to now, and that's partially explains why a lot of images that we see from the front lines have older men in those pictures, because there's a lot of experienced people who have flocked to volunteer. So continue on with the railroad story. The railway station also turned into hubs for humanitarian aid. Here at this image, you see on the left, you see um, a room that was put together for young mothers to come and have shelter in the railway station. This used to be a waiting hall, and they turned it into kind of like a temporary shelter for mothers with their children. Only women were allowed with their young children in that room, and they had everything they needed there. But of course, it's far from comfortable conditions. This is a 18-year-old volunteer in Kiev railway station, which also became just a warehouse for humanitarian aid and what used to be a ticket hall. This is Kiev, also end of March. I tried to find somewhat positive story in this terrible time, and I wanted to photograph young mothers, new mothers that were giving birth at the time of war. And what was interesting about this particular hospital, it was located right on the outskirts of Kiev, where the Russians been stopped from entering the city. So you could still hear explosions in the background, and sometimes rounds of gunfire. That's how close it was to the active fighting. And these mothers were giving birth there. Another story was for Billboard magazine. This was a story about musicians who have also, like everybody else, kind of turned their efforts to help Ukraine. And at that time, still everybody was scrambling, not really knowing what to do. But in March, people kind of started getting their shit together and thinking, okay, what can we do with our talent, and what can we do to help the war effort? Another interesting aspect of Ukrainian music was a lot of it was working for the Russian market, and a lot of musicians sing in Russian. Some of them are from Russia. A lot of people from Russia come to Ukraine to live. And for example, this is one of these samples. The guy was born in Russia and came to Ukraine, and he's in this band with this lady who is Ukrainian. And it's a very confusing kind of the transition for them when their countries are at war. This is also part of the story. One of the musicians is a quite popular musician in the center who is volunteered for one of the units, and he was fighting at the same time as continuing to be a musician. Towards April, beginning of May, a lot of Ukrainians who have fled the country started coming back, and this story was shot in Poland about Ukrainians who are coming back to Ukraine. At that time, Russians had been pushed back from Kiev region, and they were regrouping for what later became an assault on the eastern Ukraine in Luhansk and Donetsk regions. And this story was a portrait story of people who were coming back and in transit. This was shot for Wall Street Journal. And a lot of stories like that, I try to research beforehand and pitch to editors that I work with, and then if they're interested, of course, I'm going and shooting these stories. And sometimes I'm shooting these stories without having committed publication, and then try to publish it afterwards.
And how long were you there shooting at this stage?
So this is my second trip, and the first trip was March till April, March till the beginning of April, and then I came back in May. So this is beginning of May. and this is in Poland.
And what is the determining factor for you personally to come and leave, go back? How does that work for you, from an emotional standpoint?
It's, of course, it's very difficult, and this war is, for obvious reason, very personal for me. I try to take breaks and come back to New York, and I if it was all up to me, I would be in Ukraine all the time. But I have some commitments here, so I have to come back and forth. And also, I feel I'm in a very luxurious and privileged positions where I can leave when I can come and go and take breaks. Meanwhile, a lot of my colleagues, especially Ukrainian photographers who are there all the time, they don't take breaks, and it's incredibly difficult. And I encourage all photographers working in hazardous conditions to take these breaks and breathe out.
And I mean, as a colleague to those other photographers, what are the signs you see in a photographer that may have been there too long? Like, what do you recognize?
That's a great question. When you stop caring for your life is a good sign. When you don't take precautions you would usually take. When you start taking risks that you wouldn't normally take. At least that was a sign for me.
Right. Okay. And okay. Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
No. So when you notice that in one of your colleagues, that moment sort of happening, is it easily addressed?
No,
Like,
no, it's not easily addressed at all. People neglect their safety because of when danger surrounds you all the time and you're not getting harmed, you feel more invincible. But that doesn't mean, it doesn't mean it's not gonna happen tomorrow or in an hour or in a minute. When air raid alarms going off every half an hour or every hour, at some point you are gonna go and get groceries. It's same goes for people who live there and who have to deal with it all the time. That's why we see so many casualties in the civilian populations, because Russia knows that they're gonna hit people, because there are going to be people in the residential neighborhoods, and some of them are not gonna go to the bomb shelter at this point. It's atrocious. It's awful. It's undescribable. And the worst thing you could get used to is the war. But unfortunately, it's a human thing to get used to things.
right. Yeah. Thank you.
This is a story about transportation on Ukrainian-Polish border. In April, if I'm not mistaken, Ukraine took off all the tax, what's it called? I forgot. Basically, you don't have to pay taxes to bring in a vehicle. Ukraine is not part of the European Union, and because if you buy a car in the European Union, which is much cheaper there, especially for used cars, you have to pay a certain amount of taxes to bring it to Ukraine, and they took off that tax in order to bring needed vehicles to Ukraine, because with all the vehicles destroyed, there was a shortage. There was a shortage of vehicles for military use, and as well, people who wanted to buy their own cars started going to European Union to buy cars. And we saw huge lines of cars on the Polish-Ukrainian border. And what was very interesting about it, there was a lot of cars being donated for use either on the front lines or for these territorial defense units. A lot of them needed just a simple pickup trucks or vans to transport humanitarian aid, etc., etc. So there was a huge lines of cars, both for sale on the on the market and for donations for the military use. And we spent a couple of days on the border, kind of talking with people and asking them why they're bringing their cars. And like this guy, for example, he was hauling a truck filled with cars for donating to the military. A lot of these cars were bought with money from people donating, and then it would be brought to the border. So this is a Polish driver. Then he would drive it to the border. Ukrainian driver would take over from the border and then drive it to wherever the cars are designated to. Or this woman, for example, she had a very interesting story. She got to Poland, where she met a Polish guy who bought this car in Germany to be donated to a specific unit in Ukrainian military in one of the volunteer battalions. So just for this one car, she came to Poland, where she picked it up from the guy who bought it in Germany with his own money, and transferred it to her. So, and then she drove it to Ukraine to pass it on to this volunteer battalion. That kind of just shows this level of sacrifice of people that just completely disregarding everything else and donating their time, money, everything to do these seemingly small deeds that help much larger picture.
Yeah, I have to say, Sasha, I am so glad that you're sharing these kinds of stories, like sort of these grassroots efforts, and giving us insight into, like taking down the traffic signs, taking down the street signs in these little towns so the Russians won't know where they're going. This story with the cars, it's it really gives you that insight to the suffering on all these levels, but the grassroots efforts that everyone is doing their part for the greater good. It's really, really good to hear these kinds of stories, like the ordinary people being heroic in their own way.
Yeah, yeah, and just because the war in Ukraine's been happening for so long, even though it was in this kind of like semi-frozen state, there's been a huge network of volunteers formed in Ukraine, and the structure of this form is incredibly horizontal. It's there's no bosses, there's no directors of things. There's people who are coordinating things, people who are volunteering their time or money to help. And to activate this network is often takes posts on social media or exchange in WhatsApp chat or a few phone calls. So that network that was created since 2014 really put Ukraine in an advantageous position when the full-scale invasion has started. And this is just one example of thousands upon thousands of them.
Yeah, someone in one of our previous weeks of showing just had images of these women sewing together camouflage nets. Right? Like, where did that start? But to your point, it just started, and they have almost factories of women sewing and doing this.
Yeah,
really beautiful.
Yeah, there's tons of examples like that, and everybody who stayed and everybody who left Ukraine have somehow involved in helping. Either people donating money every day, or they're putting links together, or they're donating their time. And it's kind of even though the war has kind of like sifting away from the front pages of the publication, it's this network is still extremely active, and it's constantly happening, and because there's so many people involved, somebody leaves and somebody else takes their place until that somebody comes back again. So it's just a nonstop machine.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Nonstop machine.
Um, um, then I did a few stories in the Kiev region, where Russians occupied a very large swath of land, and kind of the aftermath of it, which was absolutely devastating. And working on these stories, you go in one direction from Kiev, and it's complete peace. Things are intact. Um, those road signs are there, either reinstalled or still there from before the war. The houses are intact, and you go in a different direction, it's just complete destruction and awfulness. Um, but people were starting to come back, even though the threat of Russians coming back was very much still there. And I just went around to collect stories, either for assignments or for some stories I was working on my own. This was an interesting example of just everyday heroism. So this gentleman on the left, the older one, he was in one of the territorial defense units when Russians came to Irpin. There was a cluster that you probably heard a lot in the news, of suburbs of Kiev. It's Irpin, Hostomel, Bucha, and he was living in Irpin, and he didn't leave when the Russians came. As he described, it was the Russians really never came to my street. They were a couple of blocks away, so that's kind of like that's the level of optimism and resilience people have. And he was he still is, he's auto enthusiast. And he had this old Soviet kind of like all-terrain vehicle. I believe it's called Gazik, something like that. It's a very unique car because it's very skinny. And importance of that was all the bridges around were destroyed except for one bridge, which was a pedestrian bridge. And he went to that pedestrian bridge and he measured the width of it, and he realized that his little vintage car will fit right in there. So he started bringing people out of his village through this pedestrian bridge. That's not the car in the background. The car that he had, he was completely destroyed because his house was bombed. And when the Russians retreated, the whole village started donating money and finding parts to rebuild that car, which is now rebuilt. But so this guy is just one of the examples of this kind of like everyday heroes that Ukraine has in great quantities, as it's shown. This is another story about people who are coming back to their houses, dwellings, apartments that were destroyed or damaged by Russian shelling. And this couple, there was a connection between the previous picture and this picture because that guy brought them out of Irpin in that vehicle that I mentioned. And now they came back and found their house destroyed, and they live in a trailer that another neighbor found through social media for them in one day. So she posted a picture of them saying that my neighbors came back, they don't have anywhere to live now. And in a day, somebody brought a trailer for them to live in. And that again shows just an incredible amount of sacrifice people are giving to their neighbors and to people they don't know. That's from the same story. This story actually hasn't been released yet, so don't show it to anyone yet. I'm gonna start pitching it soon. So this is a couple in Bucha, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, or Irpin, that also came back to their house to find that most likely a tank round was shot at their apartment. So this goes through their balcony, through two rooms, and they uncovered the bullet in their bathroom. And what they told me was, oh, we wanted to redo the bathroom anyway. We really didn't like the tiles. So
So
that's them in their bedroom.
yeah, so Sasha, do you think, being that the war is where the war is from a geographic standpoint, that the Ukrainians are unique in their commitment to fight, their commitment to help each other, is more than other people, the Italians, the Germans, all of the French, helping each other? Is it that we're documenting so much of this, and we're seeing all this heroism, that it's unique to the Ukrainians? Or do you think if we had the luxury in other wars, dare I use the word luxury, to document that, we would have the same stories? What do you think?
I think people are people everywhere, and if God forbid war comes to somebody else's house, they will help their neighbor. For the whole European community, and I'd like to underline Poland specifically. What Polish people have done to help Ukrainians, it's just unimaginable. Poland has a lot of its own problems, including economic problems, and it's just been incredible amount of sacrifice to give your house, your shirt, your bread to people who are common. So I don't think there's a specific gene in Ukrainians uh, that assist in that. It's if you're put in that position, you understand how awful it is, and you try to help with everything you can.
It's the human condition at work.
Yeah. That's another image from that series. A young woman, that's her apartment building was completely destroyed in Borodyanka, and she's standing on just on the ruins of her house because there was nothing left there. That's another story. I'm still working on text. It's about animal rescue in Ukraine. A lot of people who, especially in the first few days of the war, a lot of people who were living in panic. They left their pets in their apartments, kind of, and from what I hear, a lot of people were thinking we're gonna come back in a couple of days. This is just this is just gonna pass. They're gonna make a deal. This can be a full scale war. Blah blah blah. And even as shells were exploding, and people are fleeing, they were still believing they're gonna come back in a couple of days. Some people ask their neighbors to look for their to look after their animals. Some just left their cats and dogs locked in, but there's a huge amount of animals that needed rescuing, and there's a network of volunteers, of shelters, and people who are just coming and feeding animals in abandoned apartments or bombed out buildings. So that's a story about that. Also haven't been released yet. Still working on it. That's in, I think, end of May, beginning of June. This is a portrait of a friend of mine who is a personal hero for me, because she brought my family out of Kharkiv when it was under bombardments and under heavy bombardments in the beginning of the war. She was one of the few people who were running people to the train station, to help them get on the evacuation trains. And that was at the time when my hometown Kharkiv was on fire and everything was in complete chaos. They were just helping people to evacuate or bring medicine to elderly or food to elderly. A lot of elderly people didn't have any sort of network to fall back on, so they kind of left stranded in their apartments, and oftentimes there were apartments that were completely unprepared for any sort of a long-term stay without groceries or medicine. So she was one of the people who was doing that, and I took her portrait in Kiev. and I'm just forever grateful to her for everything that she's done.
Sash, if you like, and I only ask you, can you share your family's journey?
Sure.
Is it your parents? Is it your children?
My family is in Kharkiv. Now they're in Germany. My family is from Kharkiv. They're all in Germany. Um, I uh, I convinced my mom to leave Ukraine in mid-February. She was also not wanting to leave, and she didn't believe that the war will start. Uh, and when when we talked, she said, "Okay, fine, I'll leave if you get me to the beach." So I got her one of these kind of like all-inclusive hotels in Egypt. So she, and the plan was she'll go there for a couple of weeks, and she'll come back. But at that time, I was feeling quite pessimistic about the situation. Um, I've been working on a lot of stories, and just analyzing news, it was fairly clear that the full-scale invasion is imminent. So I did convince her to go, and she did go. I didn't convince my aunt and my cousin to leave until the February 23rd. They finally agreed to go, and we were arranging their travel plans when on February 24th the bomb started falling.
And is that typical of your mom's age for those people to say, "Oh, it's not going to happen"? People.
Yeah, definitely. Older people were much more hesitant to leave, and still, even now, hesitant to leave. Even the mandatory evacuations, people are trying to find an excuse to stay. It's there's multitude of reasons. Fear of unknown, hope that everything is going to be fine. Not wanting to leave their home and everything they worked for their entire lives and everything they get used to. I can understand, I can sympathize with it, but at the same time, it's of course it can be very reckless for your own life and life for your close ones. Yeah. Um, So I photographed the landscape for Die Zeit, a German newspaper, in his now famous presidential offices that became kind of entrenched in sandbags and barricades. That was, I believe, in June as well. Um, and this guy was very interesting. He was about to retire from Ukrainian army in January, and he had his disability papers confirming his retirement. He was injured in 2015 while attempting to save his commander from battlefield, and he was captured. And according to him, he was rescued by a guy named Alexander Velkul, who is now the wartime administrator and of Kryvyi Rih. It's a town in the south of Ukraine, in kind of like a Ocean 11 crazy type of operation, where he changed this guy Alexander Vilkul. He changed into the like a medical uniform and commandeered an ambulance and went into occupied territories and told him that he's bringing him to a military hospital to be treated there and then tried, pretending to be on the Russian side. And they gave him to him, and he ran him back to Ukrainian controlled territories.
Wow.
But he obviously didn't retire now, and he's on the front lines. Just the soldiers, and I for some reason I particularly like this portrait about the best attitude and the most humor and the most just the positive kind of like overall feel I get from the soldiers. They're like the calmest and most humorous people you meet in Ukraine, which are of course in the most dangerous positions.
Yeah, and somebody just wrote in the chat room, it shows the age range, the
Yeah.
age range.
Yeah, a lot of folks, as we discussed before we started, have come to volunteer who have had military experience. Starting from the Soviet times, people who went through war with Afghanistan that Soviet Union waged, and the war has been going on in Ukraine since 2014. So there's a couple of generations of people who are already have military experience. And a lot of them have been called on back to service or volunteered. So there's a huge age range among Ukrainian soldiers and a lot of experience. I wanted to talk a little bit about working in Kharkiv, which is my hometown. I know we're already coming to close to our allotted time, so I'll just say
No,
a few.
it's fine, Sasha.
Okay.
No, fine.
Coming back to my hometown, it was just undescribably difficult psychologically, no matter how you prepare yourself for it. But to walk the streets you grew up in and see them in ruin was just very difficult mentally, because just just the distance between that is much shorter, and I shot a couple of stories in Kharkiv. This was one for Cincinnati magazine, and Cincinnati is a sister city of Kharkiv. And this was a story about people coming back to live in the city, even though it's still very, very dangerous. It's just 25 kilometers from Russian border, which gives it a very short range for artillery, short range artillery that Russians use a lot. And that shelling is extremely dangerous because it's extremely imprecise. So as a result, there's just such heavy casualties on the civilian side. And of course, there's neighborhoods on the outskirts that are closer to Russia that are just completely annihilated. And all these neighborhoods are totally civilian. There's no military targets there. There's no military outposts. It's just horrific to see. This is an artist who is also in territorial defense, and a friend of mine called Gamlit Zinkovsky. He's been doing street art on destroyed and damaged buildings in Kharkiv. It's one of the older parts of town. Just completely destroyed. This is a neighborhood called Saltivka. It's a residential neighborhood, and one of the actually the last kind of like the concrete block neighborhood that Soviet Union has built in Kharkiv. Kind of a typical block housing that Soviet Union was building, and as you see, it's just every other building is completely blacked out and burned down.
Yeah, Sasha, someone was asking, what did the artist write on the wall?
This says "Час чує нас," which means the time can hear us, meaning like the time in the sense of continuous time.
Okay, history. Yeah.
And this is also in that neighborhood where people who stayed in their houses are cooking just outside of the apartment block because there's no communication, electricity or water in their apartments. And as you see, it's primarily older people who, again, don't have anything to fall back on and decided to stay without leaving their houses.
Yeah, so for the elderly people, some of this must be a flashback, right? To when after World War II and everything else, and the country being built. It's like going back in time for some of those folks, huh?
Well, not even going that far. The gentleman on the left, he came from Georgia. He escaped Georgia because of the Russian invasion there. He come to Ukraine and he sees it here now. He didn't have many good things to say about Russia. He planted a little Georgian flag nearby. I don't have a picture of that here, but yeah. It's horrific. It's just one of the completely destroyed buildings in Saltivka region. And that's just yeah.
So a building like this on the left there, Sash, do they allow the people to go back into that building there on the left?
No. Buildings like that are designated as non-recoverable, but people still come back. There's been instances of people coming back after mandatory evacuations too. So, military personnel would come and make them evacuate, and then they would come back. This is a window in my apartment where I grew up, that I came back to just to put back together. Our house spared the direct hit, but there has been few mortars that landed very nearby, and the windows on both sides were shattered. So it was so surreal, to come work on stories and then come to your home to kind of like to collect shards of glass, go to a hardware store, pick up some tape to tape it in, and then go back to work on stories. And I just wanted to finish on a little positive note. This is a story, rarely happens, but this was a story for Wall Street Journal about a mother who attempted to come to Ukraine from Poland. She was working as a cleaning lady in Poland when the war started, and her son was in Zaporizhia region in a town called Energodar. And she attempted to come back when the war started to retrieve her son, but Russians have occupied her town, and military wouldn't let her through to go back to her town because it was too dangerous. So she had to come back to Poland without her son, and the reporter who met her, he met her at the border, and then he interviewed her, and then I was flying back towards Ukraine right at that time. So one of the editors I worked for they assigned me to shoot her portrait for this story. And then I kept in touch with her, and then she was able to get her son out eventually. She came back to Ukraine herself. She came all the way to the last Ukrainian outpost and convinced somebody to go to her town and retrieve her son. And she spent few days basically in that gray area and gray zone between Ukraine controlled territories and Russian occupied territories, and she was able to bring her son back. So that was one of the happy stories, I would say. And you can see just the difference, and not to sound too cliche, but you can see just the power of photography. How can it express just completely different sides of the story with the.
She looks 20 years. She looks 20 years older on the left, without her boy.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's it, guys. Thank you so much.
No, Sasha, thank you very, very much. If anyone has any questions, but I really appreciate you doing this. I know it's not easy to go through this, but everyone really, really appreciates your time and doing this. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, guys.
And certainly, you have a standing offer whenever you want to come back and show us new work.